Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Value Podcast. Today, I'm joined by a frequent guest of the channel, Dr. Robert M. Price. How are you doing today, Dr. Price?
Oh, doing great. Getting a lot of work done. Having a lot of
Excellent.
fun.
So we're continuing our discussion on your book, The Case Against the Case for Christ. And this is part 2 of that discussion. I want to start us off with discussing your chapter 3, Manuscript Evidence. There are some apologists that argue, there's so many manuscripts in the New Testament. They're just everywhere, and that's proof of the miracles, the power of God, and Jesus rose from the dead, and all that stuff. And the manuscripts are perfect. They say it's completely perfect. There's no contradiction anywhere. What do you have to say about that?
I've never read any of them that would go as far as that implies that there's absolute unanimity in the manuscript tradition. The most conservative view I know on that is called preservationism, where some who believe that God wouldn't have bothered inspiring verbally a scripture if he wasn't prepared to make sure it remained available and intact. Now, since it's absolutely obvious to any textual critic or to anybody with footnotes in their Bible that manuscripts do not agree. In fact, Bruce Metzger and others wrote this textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, in which case they have ratings for different readings that are in all manuscripts, most that we know of, some where it's a toss-up, or if it's just obviously bogus that somebody has put it in accidentally or to make a special point, something like that. And so it's obvious that the manuscript tradition is not universal. It's not the same. So what preservationists wound up saying is, I have to admit, this is almost as ridiculous. They say, well, the original text must exist somewhere intact. Now, I think perhaps some of them mean by that if you could just determine which manuscript that we do possess is the one that is perfectly preserved, well, that's all we need to know. It's out there somewhere. That would be as ridiculous as Warfield's claim that the Bible is absolutely without error, but that only applies to the original autograph manuscripts, which we don't happen to have. So if it looks like there was some kind of stubborn error or contradiction, it has to be a result of somebody messing up the text, some incompetent scribe. If we could get a look at the original, we would see that problem just evaporated. Again, that is so ridiculous. I don't think anybody actually argues it, though I could be wrong. Usually, I think what preservationism entails is that you got to do your homework, that the correct original reading, that is wording, of any and every passage survives in some manuscript. Now, if you could just weed out all the mistakes, all the things that don't belong in there, what you would have left by process of elimination would be the original text. But how are you going to do that? And do any of them claim to have done it? It's just like it's unverifiable. It's like what John Hick called eschatological verification. It's akin to somebody saying, well, I can't figure this one out, but when we get to heaven, there'll be this big seminar where angels wearing wire-rimmed glasses and looking professorial will explain all of the apparent contradictions and say, well, I know you never thought of this, but here's the underlying truth that makes them both legit. And then you'll be there saying, my gosh, how stupid. Why didn't I think of that? Well, that's absurd too. It's just this faint hope that somehow somebody, even beyond the human race, will find the answer. Until then, we can just ignore it. And of course, you can't do that, right? Because a belief in verbal inspiration and biblical authority based on it means you darn well better be prepared to stake everything on a Bible passage. But technically, you're kind of admitting you don't really know what it originally said. Whatever it was infallible. And we think it's very likely, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, or whatever. It just destroys the certitude that people seek. Business seek by appealing to the Bible in the first place. But it's just obvious. I think, by the way, that is what Bart Ehrman is getting at in his book, Misquote Jesus, when he says there's so many verbal differences and goofs in the manuscript that you'll never be able to tell what the original said. Well, various people replied to him and said, come off it. Everybody knows that almost all of these textual differences are just obvious goofs, like somebody misspelled a common word or left out an A or an an or something. It doesn't really affect the teaching at any given point. Well, that's not quite true. But mainly what Bart was saying, if I read him correctly, is that it's the theoretical possibility which apologists are introducing, the possibility that it's hopelessly screwed up and not having the originals, we'll never know. I mean, how much probability that you've got about the accuracy of the manuscript is enough for you to stake everything on it, as you're supposed to in the Bible. So that's a bad way to go. Not just one other thing, and I'll be quiet about this. When they say, look how many manuscripts survive, thousands of them in Greek, thousands more in various ancient translations. But look at the plays of Aeschylus or Sophocles or manuscripts of Plato or the Odyssey. Often we have one stinking manuscript, yet nobody loses any sleep over that. They figure it's basically what the old writer wrote. And so if we're willing to do that, we ought to be willing to do it with the Bible, number one. Number two, the divine providence involved. Why are there so many thousands of biblical manuscripts and only a couple of these uninspired? I mean, yeah, they're inspired aesthetically, but not God-inspired ancient works. What is that, like majority vote that shows that this must be an inspired work? I don't know if they're saying that. I believe I have heard people argue that way, but the answer to that is obvious. Nobody ever used the plays of Sophocles as scriptures to be read in a church every day, every Sunday of the year. The churches outnumbered theaters incredibly. And so it's natural you have a load of manuscripts of a scripture, more than you would have from essentially a secular play or philosophical dialogue. So that's just typically primitive apologetic Sunday school thinking, sad to say.
In chapter 4, you talk about no corroborating evidence, no reporters covered, but Jesus beat.
Yeah, this is an old bone of contention, but it remains important. The idea is, do you mean to tell me this man did all of these incredible miracles that would certainly appear to be violations of natural law, multiplying food miraculously, walking on the surface of the water, ascending into the sky, etc., etc., etc. You're telling me this guy did all of this stuff, and as the Gospels say, thousands of people showed up from all over Palestine all the time, and yet there is no record of this other than the Gospels? I mean, you can see why all these things would be in the Gospels, for the same reason that the walls of the Asclepia, the healing shrines of the god Asclepius, were festooned with clay tablets that were like commercials or testimonials from people that had gone to the healing shrine and slept there overnight, and in a dream Asclepius told them what to do to be healed, or just healed them on the spot. And some of them are just downright comical. They're pitches to gullible hicks who will, they hope, patronize the temple and pay their salaries. Well, there's loads of those because of why they're there. They're advertisements for this money-making cult. You can see why all these miracle stories would be in Christian evangelistic tracts, which is essentially what the Gospels are, because you're trying to win over new converts, saying, hey, Jesus did loads more miracles than these even. But I've taken the trouble to record all of these so that you will come to share my belief that he is the Son of God and all of that. Well, that's not news, right? The question is, why did people who did not have such self-seeking or self-interested motives, like a religious advertiser or a religious evangelist, why would they not give some airtime to these astonishing alleged events? Simply, I mean, there were books written, books of wonders, some of them were called, where the author would gather paradoxes and ghost stories and all kinds of crazy stuff just to entertain the reader. And we have some, Thales, his book of wonders, I think it is, and there's other ones too, very common genre. I mean, so popular journalism and whatever, journalism analogous to that practice today, you'd think they'd publicize stuff like this. Why didn't they? Well, there's a couple of answers. None of it ever happened, right? Or surely somebody would have taken notice. I mean, the Gospels depict contemporaries at the time hearing rumors and responding. What? No reporters in the crowd? So that might be it. It's just all made up. Or you might say that, the great alternative to it today is that there was a historical Jesus, and he did have a lot of fans. He was a wandering and popular teacher, kind of like certain motivational speakers today, right? And that eventually the hero worship rendered to this guy was so great that people began ascribing superhuman feats to him and eventually saying he must have been God in human form. Well, okay, but then so now you could see how reporters, even if they heard that stuff, would probably dismiss it, right? Why is, like, so what would Jesus be left with? How much of a newsworthy item would he be if he were simply one more sophist, one more popular philosopher? I think that I've used this ad nauseum, so forgive me for hitting it one more time, but to me, that's like somebody who was even more of a Superman fan than I obviously am, and decided, some generations from now, that Superman must have been real. I mean, after all, we have him in movies, TV shows and so forth. He must have been real. And somebody presents these arguments. Wait a minute. He bends steel in his bare hands. Come off it. And you might backtrack and say, well, okay, you got a point. Maybe that stuff is a legendary incrustation, a legendary embellishment. They thought so much of this guy that they expressed it symbolically. Yeah, that's it. Well, who was he then? Well, a wandering wise man. Would that really have been adequate to generate this cult of this incarnate God who could fly into the sky, etc.? It's like doing your research on Superman to come down to the historical core of what the real Superman was, because you don't want to say he didn't exist. So he did, but what kind of person was he who was great, but not everybody would have thought so, and not everybody would have magnified his character by making up stories. Well, basically, it'd be like saying the historical Superman was Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. Well, that ain't bad, but would anybody ever start publishing Action Comics and Superman comics and all that to relate the exploits of this reporter? I mean, is anybody going to make Geraldo Rivera, a courageous reporter, into a superhuman epic hero? I kind of doubt it. And so it just seems to me that it's all special pleading. And the few instances the apologists appeal to of supposedly non-Christian historians who do mention Jesus, really there are only two worth talking about. One is Josephus, who wrote in the late 1st century, decades after Jesus supposedly lived, and Tacitus, a Roman historian who wrote about 125 CE or AD. And neither one of them have that much to say, and nothing to say that couldn't easily have been gotten from reports of what Christians in their day believed. I mean, that's, it's not like they said, oh, I was lucky enough to see Jesus perform one of his vaunted miracles. There's nobody like that on record, right? And so the very paucity of supposed attestations of Jesus are like the exceptions that prove the rule. Surely, if there was this guy doing all these things, there would be much more ample documentation.
In chapter 5, you talk about the stones keep mum, how biblical archaeology digs up a world without Jesus.
Yeah, the question is still open because you never know what you're going to find next. But based on the way the archaeological digging in Palestine or the Holy Land or whatever you want to call it what it's yielded so far, there are big problems. The Old Testament, really, that one is really problematic because there simply is no archaeological evidence, remains of things that would have to have left behind plenty of it, like the Exodus. There's like 3 or 4 hypothetical routes from Egypt into Canaan that scholars have figured out. But there's no evidence around any of them. That is, you're talking about 1 million people on the road with a huge herd of cattle. You'd think that there'd be burials and broken jars and weapons and cast off clothing and all kinds of stuff. Well, but there's not. Now, what happened? Did God send a cleanup crew of angels down after Moses and the gang got into Canaan and said, okay, we better get this all cleaned up by tomorrow? God will be doing an inspection. Then why? What would be the point? Right? Some guy said that he found evidence of Egyptian chariot wheels at the bottom of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, mistranslated as the Red Sea in the Bible. But that turned out just to be a kind of a weird shell or crustacean formation. People have claimed to have found ancient coins that have micro letters that mention Jesus and so on. But there's no way anybody had the jeweler's technology to do such tiny engraving. So the guy was just hallucinating or something. No evidence of the Temple of Solomon or the Palace of David. And you'd have to have truckloads of it. I mean, oh, well, the temple was destroyed. Well, it didn't say they smashed it all to atoms or they hauled away every bit of it somewhere to a city dump. Why are there no remains? There would have to be. It's the same thing with Mecca. In the Quran, it's supposed to have been a metropolis. A lot of trading and commercial business went on there, and loads of idol shrines to other gods. But turns out, once the archaeologists visited the place, it was basically just a convenience store and a gas pump, the equivalent, of course. What happened? Well, tall tale telling is what happened. Now, in the New Testament, the biggest problem is Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. Well, there's some confusion there because it usually calls him Jesus the Nazarene, which for centuries was a known label for a pious Jewish mystical sect, kind of like the Samaritans, kind of like the Mandeans, probably some overlap. Whereas there was no town called Nazareth. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, during the decades Jesus is said to have lived, that is, in the first half of the first century AD or CE. It looks like Nazareth, which was on a plateau, had been settled and inhabited for previous centuries, but it had become a ghost town long before the Gospels. But what do you know? They decided to do some urban renewal, and about 50 CE or AD, that is after Jesus is gone, according to tradition, they began to resettle it. And so by the time the Gospels were written, there was again a town called Nazareth, as there is today still. But the problem is no one has ever been able to show definitively that any artifact, any coin, any vase, any amphorae, anything dates definitely to the time Jesus is supposed to have been in Nazareth. That doesn't mean some of it might not stem from that time, but none of the stuff that is, it's undateable. There's no telltale signs like there are on the coins and shards and all of that stuff. So as far as we know, nope. Similarly, were there Galilean synagogues? Well, we only know, they're like local houses of worship, not in the temple, but if people wanted to go to weekly services, they certainly couldn't necessarily go all the way to the temple. They did that 3 times a year for the big feasts. But what would you do every Sabbath? Well, you could go to synagogue, which just means meeting house, a Greek term. And there you would hear the Torah scrolls read and comments on them and people singing some of the Psalms, much like a church service. And so that was like a kind of a temple away from the temple, you might say. Well, there weren't, as far as we can tell from the remains, there aren't any in Galilee that go back the north of Samaria and Judea. But the place where Jesus supposedly lived, we don't see any of those except oddly, well, maybe not so oddly, in a couple of Hellenistic cities. Caesarea Philippi, which is actually mentioned in the Gospels, and another one that I'm forgetting offhand, that Herod or Herod Antipas, I forget which, had caused to be built for the sake of people who left, who were Jews, but had grown up outside the Holy Land and were used to synagogue services. But they didn't understand what was going on in the ones in Judea, and they didn't live in Judea. So these synagogues were built for them during the supposed time of Jesus. But the Gospels imply Jesus going to various synagogues all over Galilee every Sabbath. That begins to look pretty dubious. It looks like that, again, later there were synagogues, and how much later? Well, after 70 AD, after the terrible war with Rome. The same problem occurs. Were there Pharisees in the Gospels dogging Jesus's steps and debating him? Looks like not. Who knows? But they were based in Jerusalem because their piety had to do with the Jerusalem temple. They apparently did not make it up to Galilee often. And one Pharisee who did and came back, he wasn't too high on the place. He said, "Oh, Galilee, thou who hatest the Torah." Another one said, "The whole time I was there, nobody asked me a single question about the Torah." So it looks like it was not crawling with scribes and Pharisees as the Gospels would suggest. And now, after 70, when the temple had been destroyed, you had a bunch of Pharisees relocate up in Galilee. And it's like the gospel authors are imagining that it must already have been that way in the time of Jesus. And so there's not evidence where you'd think there'd have to be evidence. Now, maybe someone will come up with some. I welcome it. I want to know anything we can know about that. And I always say that you must keep your historical hypotheses hypothetical and provisional, because you never know what's going to turn up. But based on what we do know now, it looks pretty bad for archaeology proving the Bible.
A super chat question from Greatest Joke of All Time. Thank you for your super chat. Dr. Price, why is there no laughing Jesus story?
Good question. The only thing like that I know of is in the apocryphal Acts of John, where Jesus isn't involved in it, but John, son of Zebedee, is still on missionary journeys throughout the Mediterranean when he's an old man. And he and his companions have to stop for the night, and the only thing available is a stinking crummy flea bag of an inn. But that's all they've got. And they all have to crowd into one room, which has but a single straw mattress in it. Well, they all say, "Oh, let's let John have that, such as it is. He needs what little comfort we can give him." Well, unfortunately, this mattress is crawling with bed bugs. Seeing it, John is not too thrilled about passing the night in this nest of vermin. So he says to the bed bugs, "Leave the servants of God alone." And sure enough, all the bed bugs march out of the mattress and leave the room. Well, and the other preachers with John laugh at the scene. That's about everything I can think of in early Christian literature where somebody's getting a good laugh out of something. You might say that the crowd around the house of Jairus, when Jesus goes there to raise his daughter from the dead, they're laughing Jesus to scorn. But I don't think that counts. They're just scoffing at him, right? Or maybe the thief on the cross is deriding him. But somebody having a good-natured laugh at something. I know there was one of these millions of TV movies about Jesus a few years ago, where they have Jesus playing soccer or something with the disciples, and he's laughing it up. Boy, that's not the Jesus I see in the Gospels. Elton Trueblood used to be a big time conservative speaker. He did a book called The Humor of Christ. And as I remember, it doesn't say anybody's laughing, but it points out certain things Jesus says by way of exaggeration that are kind of absurd, and you could to make a point. You think anybody lights a lamp and make sure there's oil in the lampstand and gets ready to settle down in his easy chair to read, and he says, "Oh, I forgot one thing." And he runs to go get a bushel basket to clump down over the oil lamp. No, the very idea is ludicrous. No one would do that. And some other things he says, like when you give alms to the poor, don't be like the hypocrites who make sure they've got a guy playing the trumpet along with them. When they stop on the street to throw a couple of coins in a beggar's tin cup. Hey, everybody, now hear this. I'm about to give to charity. I know you won't want to miss this. Okay, that is absurdly funny. And there's a few things like that, but did Jesus get any laughs, or did he laugh? Who knows? I like to think he might laugh if he's up in heaven and is watching the life of Brian, but who knows, though. But you're right. That's a real good question. Was Jesus a sourpuss, or were the early Christians sourpusses? I'd like to know.
Greatest joke of all time. Thank you for another super chat. Is there any truth to the rumor that someone time traveled to the past and invented Jesus to make the world a better place? Did Daniel time travel?
Well, there are about 3 or 4 science fiction novels where something like this happens. The best, well, the only one I can be sure I even read years ago was one by Michael Moorcock, who is famous for his great sword and sorcery tales of Elric of Melniboné, who is a sword-wielding sorcerer. Really, they keep saying they're going to make a movie of him. I can't wait. I love those books. Well, he wrote one that's very different in kind, where this guy, I happen to remember his name is Carl Glogauer. He is sort of a nerd. He's persecuted as a kid. But he I guess becomes an inventor, or he knows somebody that is, I forget. And there's a time machine. And this guy says, okay, I got nothing here. I want to go back into the past and see for myself what Jesus was like. Well, it works, and he somehow comes to the right time, and there's a Nazareth. How do I get there? And he goes in there. Does anybody know where Mary and Joseph and their children live? And finally he gets directions, and he goes there, and sure enough, there's Mary washing the dishes and Joseph in the carpenter shop. And they said, could I perhaps meet your son, Jesus? Well, if you're sure you want to. And they unlock this door to a room, which is essentially a padded cell. And there is Jesus, who is a malevolent, monstrous, misbegotten, insane person. But it does check out as being Jesus somehow. It's definitive. What's this guy going to do, the time traveler? He says, well, I don't know how we could have gotten from this to the founder of Christianity, but I got to try to make sure it does happen. And so what he does is to assume the role of Jesus. And I guess he knows the Gospels pretty well, and he preaches the stuff that's in them. I don't know that he has any luck with miracles, but I don't even remember. But he does become Jesus, even to the point of coming to the attention of the Romans and getting crucified. And he's happy that he did it, because now, thanks to him, the gospel story is basically true. So that there are a couple of others. I just don't remember titles or authors, but that's well worth reading, I think.
Okay, let's get to the next chapter. A buttload of evidence.
Well, I think he had a truckload of evidence or something, right? And that's, I do have my copy with me tonight. Let's see what the heck I was. Oh, yeah, here we are. Let me
The
just.
subtitle of that chapter is Jesus Seminar in Mainstream Biblical Research. So I think you're criticizing the conclusions of the seminar. You
Yeah,
talk about the seminar several times in this chapter.
For one thing, I argue against Greg Boyd and others who say that they do see real oral tradition and that we do have a good amount of stuff. I mean, he would go farther than that as an evangelical believer, and he believes it's inerrant, but his point is, what could you prove to someone who didn't bring that doctrine to the table with them? Well, quite a bit. And so he is challenging the skepticism of Bart Ehrman and others, people like that, that say, well, miracles couldn't have happened. And I always say, well, you're really arguing in a circle there. They always say that these critics operate with a naturalistic presupposition, a worldview in which miracles cannot happen and do not happen, and therefore any story we read of them must be made up at some point. Well, because now if you didn't bring that invidious assumption to the text, you wouldn't have any trouble, Greg and the others would say, recognizing this stuff as good oral tradition, testimony. And I beg to differ. I point out that no, somebody is bringing to the text an inflexible assumption, all right, but it's you, because notice how apologists don't accept miracle stories from other religions or from legends. No, they want you to accept miracles in the Bible and all the miracles in the Bible. Like C.S. Lewis said, if you say, as a kind of liberal theologian, you'll accept the resurrection, but the rest of it you can't buy. Oh, wait a minute, if you're willing to go with the big one, you might as well go with a small fry too. No, it doesn't all stand or fall together, and so they can defend or think they can defend that all the biblical miracles happened. And if you don't think so, it's only because you're stubborn and don't believe they could have. No, the inflexible assumption is the person like the apologists who are saying, I know that all the miracles in the Bible happened because of what? The possibility that miracles could happen? No, it's more than that. No, you're saying that that any report in the Bible of a miracle must be historically true. Now, why would that follow from miracles being possible? For your granting that there is an all-powerful God who could do anything. Like, let's grant that. Does that demand that every miracle recounted in the Bible must be true? No. It's like, well, it says God created the world in 6 days, and being God, he could have. Well, God didn't have to do everything he might have done. I mean, presumably he could have created the world in 6 nanoseconds. Does that mean he had to do it? And it's just that they are bringing the assumption of biblical inerrancy. Even they don't see it, but that's what they're doing. So that's why they think they have a lot of evidence. Also, there's this thing I mentioned once before, these dubious appeals they make to anthropologists studying oral tradition, because what they wind up doing, oddly, is showing the very opposite of what they think they're proving. Because it shows that modern day societies in which oral traditions are alive and well are not verbally accurate. The anthropologist that discovered this said There's no such thing as an original to one of these ballads that these singers do in the Balkans. No, every performance is a new work. It has certain continuities with the old, but they always wing it. That, are you saying that's what happened in the Bible? If so, you're on my team. And then also, I think there's one other element of this. Oh, wait a minute. Now I had it and I've lost it. There was another argument they make here. I'll have it in just a second. Let's just see. Well, they. One thing I just pick out arbitrarily, I noticed they always say that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. And of course, that's unprovable. But let's assume that the authorship ascriptions might be true. What does it say about that? If you take Matthew can be shown to have used Mark, and nobody says Mark was an apostle or an eyewitness disciple. And if, however, Matthew was, why is he using and changing Mark? Obviously, he didn't have that much confidence in it. He changes it all over the place. And they just haven't really thought through the specifics. One thing that Bart Ehrman once said, that what started shaking his faith in the inerrancy of the Bible was looking at a gospel harmony. You know, they have the three columns with Mark in the middle, Matthew and Luke on the sides with the same material, so you can see how exactly the words differ, even though you've got, you know, different versions of the same passage. And Bart said, well, it wasn't that was unreasonable to posit. It was very reasonable, but he was used to thinking that the Gospels were totally accurate. And if Matthew said Jesus said so-and-so, A, B, C, then he must have. If Luke said he said D, E, and F, well, that must be true. But wait a minute. If they're describing the same occasion, why? What? Then you get to these ridiculous theories. Well, Jesus said something similar twice. Oh, come off it. And this is the kind of utterly contrived reasoning that you're finally forced to hold to. And if you don't, if you get sophisticated enough, as I suspect Mike Licona will, and he's very sophisticated, and Greg Boyd, and some of these guys, I think eventually you'll find yourself following in the footsteps of me and Dennis MacDonald and Bart Ehrman and a whole bunch of others who wanted to remain critical evangelicals and say, okay, it's not verbal inspiration and inerrancy, but it's still solid history. Well, you're not standing on the firm ground of faith anymore. If you get to that point, you are stepping knowingly into the swampy bog of probabilities. You're like the Jesus seminar, where they're debating what's the percentage that Jesus really did or said. There's, I guess, maybe 75% that he did. Okay, let's vote that one pink. I'd say it's about 98% on this. Okay, that one's red. Is that all you can do? Well, it doesn't matter that much if you're simply a scholar, but if you're predicating your eternal salvation and that of your hearers on these iffy propositions, I just don't think you can continue to do that. Eventually, you're going to realize that just does not work. The Bible does not afford such probability. Oh, yeah, I remember the one other thing I was going to say about the Jesus seminar, which I thoroughly enjoyed being a part of. for some years. They've put out, I think the Gospel According to the Jesus Seminar, or something, where they say, here's what we think is left in terms of stuff Jesus actually said and did. And it so happens that it works out that in both categories, each one of them, it's about 18% of the stuff they think is authentic. Well, I went through that, and the result is in my book, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems. And I said, let's use the criteria that the Jesus Seminar uses on all the material, and look at how they might have applied it to the material they retained. Because it seems to me that all of the stuff they voted red or pink, definitely or probably said or done by Jesus, is vulnerable to the same objections that caused them to vote everything else gray and black. And I explain why. So I'm afraid they're really, you can't demonstrate that there's any authentic Jesus material. There might be, but you got a lot of explaining to do, and the explaining I've heard is not very convincing.
We got another super chat. Christopher Malloy, thank you for your super chat. He says, all of the theories about a historical Jesus, which is the most plausible? P.S. Sorry if the Jesus action figure offended you.
Oh, I'd forgotten who sent me that, Chris. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I've got him right on the shelf over there next to a different Jesus action figure and two different Moses figures. And there's Goliath over on that shelf in the Old Testament section. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Very, very clever and kind of you. Okay, as to the theories about the historical Jesus, to me, the most plausible is Jesus the Zealot, Jesus the armed revolutionary, partly because of the cleansing of the temple story. It says that he threw out all of the merchandisers and livestock sellers and money changers from the court of the Gentiles. Now, that was a huge area. And it says that he wouldn't let anybody bring back any of the sacrificial vessels. That's the Greek word skewo, or the skewon, I forget, too late at night, which means sacred vessels used for gathering the blood up and pouring out the holy water and so forth. He wouldn't let anybody bring the stuff back in. Well, this area was the size of several football fields. How many men must Jesus have had with him? And mustn't they have been armed to enable him to do that? Because we're told that they had a bunch of armed temple police stationed, more than usual because it was Passover season. They just let him get away with this? You could say, well, they realized it could get pretty bloody if they descended on them right there and then. Well, that would make sense, but then why are they there at all? If you don't plan to use these guys and you're just going to rely on snitches, which is what they finally do with Judas, the scene doesn't fit. So there's that. And later on, we're told that Barabbas, or however you want to say it, was in prison because he had killed somebody during the insurrection. What insurrection do you suppose that was? The only one mentioned as a recent event was Jesus taking over the temple. Maybe there was more of a scuffle there than they're letting on. But here and elsewhere, Mark left certain, and other evangelists left certain loose ends hanging out. And if you start pulling on them, you begin to realize, more to this than I thought. At the Last Supper, Jesus says, remember in the old days when I sent you out to preach, you didn't lack anything, did you? You got support from the people you preached to. Yes, Lord, no problem. Well, now I'm telling you, things are changing. It's not going to be so easy anymore. If you don't have a sword, you better sell your cloak and buy one because you're going to need it. And they say to him, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he says, that's enough. Now, is he trying to shut them up because they don't understand? Well, what is it they don't understand? Because when they get to the Garden of Gethsemane, a fight begins. We're told that Peter tries to split the skull of one of the arresting party and misses and just slices the poor guy's ear off. But then Jesus stops it. But in other words, it's telling you there was some kind of violence there, though cut short when they all ran away. What about speaking of the disciples? Ever notice the epithets? Simon the Zealot? Well, there was this revolutionary Essene type group called the Zealots, founded by Judas of Galilee, who said, no king but God. We're not tolerating Romans and Roman taxation. And they started a revolt. And everybody was crucified afterward. This is 6 AD when Jesus was born, according to Luke. How about, well, there's also in some manuscripts a Judas the Zealot. And that's kind of interesting because Simon and Judas are 2 of the Maccabean brothers who were rebels against the Seleucids. Then there is Peter, Simon Bar Jonah. Well, we usually think that means son of Jonah, but that was not an ordinary epithet name. It would seem to mean son of Jonah, but I don't know enough about the languages, but I have read that that's not a name you would expect to find, whereas there was a common noun, Bar Jonah, same spelling, which meant outcast or criminal or terrorist. Was that what it meant? Oh geez, there's at least another one, Boanerges, the sons of thunder, James and John, so on. There are all these odd things that to me make Jesus sound like another Judas of Galilee. And I tend to think that this kind of does make a lot of sense as a possible sketch of the historical Jesus. And of course, most of that evidence is gone because it would have been whitewashed by the Christians who wanted to stay together, but realized that any further revolutionary activity was doomed to failure. And so they made Jesus into more of a pacifist and tried to say, well, yeah, I know Jesus got executed by Rome, but it was all a setup. He didn't do it. It was a frame up and so forth. So that's the one I think most likely, though there are several possibilities. Geza Vermesh makes an interesting case for Jesus as a Galilean Hasid, kind of a shaman and miracle worker. Chaim Maccabee makes Jesus a kind of liberal Pharisee. So does Harvey Falk. Then Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Louisa Shatroff make Jesus into kind of an early feminist. John Dominic Crossan and Richard Horsley make Jesus into a community organizer. Seems a little anachronistic to me. And so on down the line there. Others make Jesus into a kind of a cynic sage. Others see him as an apocalyptic prophet, and so on and so on. And the maddening thing is that none of these things, well, there's one or two that strike me as kind of silly, but on the whole, most of them can claim evidence in the Gospels. And so the name of the game then is to say, what strikes me as authentic and central? Because I can claim then that that is a reminiscence of the historical Jesus. But all the stuff that doesn't fit it, was added in later by people with other interests. That sounds kind of silly, but it isn't. I have to admit that some of the cases made for this are pretty impressive. So it's and there are yet others I haven't gotten into here, but to me the one that makes the most sense, if there was a historical Jesus, is that he was a revolutionary would-be king. I recommend either of the books on this by S.G.F. Brandon. One is, I think, The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church. The other is Jesus and the Zealots.
Let's look at the next super chat question. Greatest joke of all time. Thank you for your super chat. Why does Jesus in all the scriptures say, in the scriptures says he had defeated the world, and in some he will save the world?
Well, both of those occur in the Gospel of John. And I have overcome the world. He says, therefore, don't worry. You will be persecuted, but you'll come out on top. Well, in the same context, he says, now is the archon of this world cast down, the ruler of this world. Well, we know from 1 John that what he must mean is the demiurge or the devil or the wicked ruler of this world, which is why it's such a mess. But Jesus has come to put an end to all that. And so once he does his saving work of on the cross and is lifted up, which is practically the same thing as the ascension in the Gospel of John, he has then defeated the ruler of this world, Satan, and then he will presently return in the form of the Paraclete and bring peace to those who abide in him. You can tell that the Gospel of John was originally a Gnostic text, and they did not believe in a futuristic eschatology. That is, they didn't believe in a future resurrection of the dead. They thought that was kind of superstitious. They thought that the real resurrection was baptism and receiving the Spirit. That's why in John 5, I think, Jesus says, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead in their graves, just when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. But then, a few verses later, somebody is added, don't be surprised at this, for the hour is coming, and he doesn't say, and now is. The hour is coming when the dead in their graves, right, the literally rotting dead, will hear the voice of the Son of God, whether they want to or not, and come forth to face the judgment. Well, somebody has, at that and several other points, tried to tone down the Gnostic character of John and restore this future expectation. But in the form of John we have, you have you have both views side by side. And like when Mary of Bethany or Martha, I forget which, Lazarus is dead and he's in the tomb, and one of the sisters comes up to Jesus and say, Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, oh, I know he'll rise at the last day when everybody else does someday in cold comfort. And Jesus says, no, I am the resurrection. And he says, if a man believe in me and live, if a man, though he were dead, believes in me, he shall live, and whoever believes in me, shall never die, but has everlasting life. So there's these two conflicting ideas, but that's how Jesus saves the world in the Gospel of John, at least in the original text, by making the Paraclete, the Spirit of truth, available. But it's not going to be a world of peace and plenty. It's not going to be the traditional millennium, because the early church was disappointed too often. And like groups today that have a date picked out for the end of the world, and it always passes, it never happens. What do? Well, they always say, well, it did happen, just not the way we thought it would. Yeah, you're living in the kingdom of God now if you're willing to live that way. Yeah, right. But that's how the defeating the world is defeating the ruler of this world, Satan. The saving of the world is the introduction to eternal life now, a different quality of life, which is a kind of backpedaling, excuse making, to put it bluntly, in my view.
Let's get to the next one. Jordan Bickett, thank you for your super chat. Many laugh out loud asides in that book. I loved when the apologist claimed Jesus alluded to I am during the walk on water, but he just meant it's me.
Yeah, if that's the only passage you had with ego, a me on the lips of Jesus, that would make sense, right? If they're saying, oh my God, it's a ghost. And he says, no, it's me. That I could accept. But the problem is they're trying to say that he's invoking the divine name on his own behalf. And in most of the other instances in John, it certainly doesn't mean that. I mean, it does have theological weight to it. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection, etc. I am the good shepherd. I'm the door for the sheep. But these are like, what are they called? Aretology stories, like when Isis in an ancient document says, I am the goddess Isis, here are the things I've done for the human race. It's that kind of thing. And it just seems to me reducing it to silliness to say that it just means, oh yeah, it's me. In one of my books, I say, can you imagine? It's hot one day in Judea, and Jesus says, well, I'm for going in for some ice cream. Who's with me? Oh, I am. Oh, did they all claim to be God? It's just, I mean, it's conceivable, but that just seems to me gross overinterpretation. And what would it really mean? Oh boy, anyhow, it just, they want to make Jesus God and claiming to be God all the time. And sometimes they're right, but it's a mixed bag in the Gospel of John.
All right, let's get right back to the book. We're at chapter 7, the identity crisis. Did Jesus memorize the Nicene Creed?
Yeah, did he already think he was God? It's amazing to me how apologists will be totally anachronistic, and if they say Jesus claimed to be God, and that's the chief one, though the Trinity is another one. If Jesus does say, as he does once or twice, I and the Father are one, or he who has seen me has seen the Father, or in one place where he says, this is the reason I came here from God. The way I translate that is, this is why I emerged from the Godhead. I think they're under translating that one. So I'm not some sort of Unitarian hostile to the idea that Jesus might have, at least the literary Jesus, might have been claiming, like Krishna, that he is God in disguise. Sure, he could be. Though there are signals that go in the opposite direction too, even in that same book. But suppose he did claim to be God. Does that mean he was a polytheist, a ditheist, a tritheist, a Trinitarian, a modalist? I mean, apologists want to jump immediately to the Council of Nicaea, or better yet, the Council of Chalcedon, because that's what they have in mind when they say Jesus claimed to be God. And you just can't do that. If Jesus had ever made a claim of that nature, would it have taken 300 years for Christian theologians to hammer it out? He can't have, unless everybody just wasn't listening that day. So it's like the baptismal formula, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Oh, well, you see, that's the Trinity. No, it's not. It might be, but we're not told how to connect those dots. Again, is it three gods? Is it three different authorities? Like some people would baptize in the name of Solomon and so and so and so and so, names of power. What does that mean? You just can't swallow the whole history of Christian dogma in one gulp and claim that that's what the New Testament is doing. That's why it's important to study theology as well as the Bible. Each is sort of a check on the other.
In chapter 8, you talk about the psychology of heresy. Must apologists be crazy when they say Jesus believed he was God?
This is an interesting observation I have made. I could be wrong about it, but it seems fair and square to me. You know, the liar, lord, or lunatic trilemma that C.S. Lewis came up with in Mere Christianity. He said, given the nature of what Jesus claimed about himself, he would have to be either a wicked charlatan or a lunatic on the level of a guy who thinks he's a poached egg, or God. You really don't have any other choices. Oh, don't you now? Well, one of them, he really had nothing for biblical criticism. And you can see that in his laughable and infuriating essay, Biblical Criticism and Modern Theology, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, where he says, well, really all the hypotheses of Bultmann and all these guys, all of them are possible, but they're merely probable. And so none of them have 100% certainty. And that's true of every one. So if you link them all together, what have you got? It's a chain of weak links. The whole thing has a very low probability, since each piece of it has a lower probability. And what he doesn't seem to understand is that apologetics arguments are the same way, right? And nothing that any apologist ever says, especially about the Gospels, is any more than somewhat likely to be true. And some of those are pretty far-fetched. And so he just has not really looked at gospel criticism, and therefore it simply doesn't seem to occur to him that the Gospel of John is not a blow-by-blow account of things Jesus really did and said. He doesn't make anything of the radical difference between John and the other three Gospels in terms of the subject matter and the idiom of teaching and the order of events in the story. It doesn't just like water off a duck's back to old Lewis. And so when you say, well, there is at least another option in your trilemma, namely that Jesus has been misquoted, that he didn't say this, but that other people thought he did or must have or should have. Like, in fact, in the Gospel of John, they're about ready to stone him to death. And Jesus says, hold on a second. I've done a lot of good deeds. Which one of those you think deserves capital punishment? And they say, well, none of the good deeds, but here you are, a man making yourself equal with God. You're claiming to be God. And what does Jesus say? Darn right, no. He says, wait a minute. You can't contradicts scripture. And doesn't it say in the Psalms that God says to Israel, I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you, yet you will die like mortal men, like kings, and because you've miscarried justice, you haven't been good rulers to the. Actually, in the psalm, it's El Elyon, the Most High, rebuking his 70 sons who he appointed gods of the nations, Yahweh being the God of Israel. And he says, okay, that's it. I'm kicking you all off your thrones. You're going to die and wind up in Sheol. And because it says they stumble about in darkness and so forth. And Jesus is going with the traditional view, though, that he's just talking to Israelites to whom the prophets had spoken. So Jesus says, look, if he calls those who receive the word of God gods, what are you giving me a hard time for? All I said was I'm God's son. Now that is pretty remarkable. So what are you talking about? I'm claiming to be God. The Bible seems to let people do that, but I haven't. Now wait a second. Which did he actually say, or both? And we just can't figure it out. Who knows? But the idea of claiming to be God, if you return an affirmative answer to that, what do you think Jesus had in mind? Everything you have in mind? I don't think you can prove that, and that makes a lot of difference. It's just amazing the arrogance people have to think they know the truth of God and the will of God. Yeah, good luck.
Chapter 9, the pithal evidence. Could a finite Jesus correspond in any way to an infinite God?
Yeah, I think Kierkegaard said that was the great paradox, that the infinite and eternal God could become a finite man. But that's almost brings up the thing I said about the previous chapter. What do you think you are saying when you say something like that? That the inexpressible, incomprehensible God has become a finite man. It's like saying fire has changed into water. What do you think you're saying? I mean, it seems to me what this amounts to is making an idol of a great man, if there was one, and or making him a symbol, which is still a pretty nimble, agile mental maneuver that I think few can carry out when they're saying, oh, yes, I'm worshiping Jesus, but not exactly Jesus himself. He's really a kind of a conveyor to God. That's even Tillich says some stuff like that, which strikes me as very hard to get your brain around. So what evidence could there ever be that the eternal, infinite God has become a man? You don't even know what you're saying happened. And given, like, would you start looking for little clues that Jesus was infinite, that he crowded everybody out wherever he went, because being infinite there was no room left for anybody else? Absurd, of course not. Would Jesus be omniscient and therefore he's God? Can you really imagine that while Jesus is saying, little girl, I say to you, rise, simultaneously he's thinking of the day he created the planet Neptune? And he's counting the number of dinosaur species there used to be. And he's foreseeing what Stephen King is writing in his next novel. It's absurd to say a human person can be omniscient. Oh, and this gets me back to the trilemma thing, too. One of the heresies of the early church was Apollinarianism. Apollinaris was a disciple of Athanasius, the one that argued against Arius, that the Word of God, the Logos, must share the same nature as God, not just a creation, not just similar to God, but sharing the divine nature and therefore can be called God. He's another person in the Godhead. Okay. Um, that's what Athanasius argued. And he won the debate in the Council of Nicaea. But some years later, a disciple of his, Apollinaris, said, "Yeah, I believe that, but I think I've found a place where Athanasius didn't manage to lock it down completely. If you say Jesus was true God and true man, well, what's involved with being true man? Um, I mean, if he's simply a man, what do you got? You got man here and God here. What can they have to do with each other?" And he said, "Well, I guess that instead of a spirit, like we all have, body, soul, and spirit, um, Jesus was 2/3 human, but 3/3 God. He didn't have a human spirit because the divine spirit, the Holy Spirit, took the place of that." He's got to plug in somewhere. Forgive the stupid language there. Whoo boy, that didn't work out. And he got challenged by those who said, "Hey, wait a minute. Aren't we saying that salvation works and gives us divinity in some sense anyway, because God became man so that man might become God?" Yeah. Well, if he's only becoming 2/3 man, he can only save 2/3 of a man. That's ridiculous to suggest. And so they said, Apollinaris, that was okay with him, though. But the three Cappadocians, as they were called, Basil of Caesarea, um, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzen, they said, no. What is not assumed is not redeemed. Again, if he didn't take on the whole human organism, then he didn't completely save any human being. So he must have. And that gets you into big problems, obviously, which get debated in the Nestorian controversy and so on. But I don't need to go further into that. The thing was, for the moment, that they condemned Apollinaris's view as a heresy because it would make salvation impossible. It was a deficient Christology. Well, what does Lewis say in the trilemma thing? Why couldn't Jesus have been like the guy who thinks he's a poached egg? The trilemma says, and the three Cappadocians are saying, if it was a real incarnation, he must have had a human mind, or soul or spirit or whatever you want to call it. And if he knew all this stuff, like the other day when I created a planet or two while I had a few minutes, if he is all knowing and all wise, I don't think a human brain can accommodate that. I don't think a human soul can live with that. You're talking about something that's going to blow all the circuits immediately. So isn't Lewis propounding Apollinarianism, that though Jesus had a full human body and most of humanity, he had a divine spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it, instead of the lousy one we have? And it seems to me that I mean, I'm open to debate about that, but it seems to me that might mean that Lewis's view is technically heretical. Keep thinking about it. I mean, I'm not the authority on this, but Christology, heresy, and all these things are almost reflections of one another.
We have another super chat from Jack Rory Staunton. Thank you for your super chat. Hi, Jacob. Bob, please unpack sons of gods, sons of man terminology in Old Testament, New Testament, Dead Sea Scrolls, and how it bears on Jesus' nature, human, Enochian, watcher.
The sons of God in most of the places in the Old Testament, like Genesis 6, where they cohabit with mortal women, Job 1, where the sons of God all gather to report to God, Deuteronomy 32, where the sons of God each receive a fiefdom to rule as their God. Some of the Psalms which says, "Who in the heavens is like you, O Yahweh? Who among the sons of God," etc., etc. These things didn't originally denote angels; they were lesser gods, and you really have to do some text twisting to make it sound like something else. But eventually, by the time of the New Testament, it is being taken that way. That's because Judaism had become more monotheistic and they couldn't bear to speak of lesser gods actually existing. No, their idea by that time was the pagans are worshiping demons. The poor saps don't realize it, or they're just angels. Yeah. Son of man means, let's see, several different things. In the Old Testament, as in the Psalms, the Son of Man, synonymous with the sons of men, just means human beings. Uh, Sort of like Shakespeare says, "How like a god, and yet a mortal." When I, what is it, Psalm 8? When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast made, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? And so on. So mere humans, yet amazing creatures of God. In Ezekiel, the angel addresses the prophet as Son of Man. Son of Man, can these bones live again? Mere mortal. And as a result, Ezekiel says, "You alone know that, Lord." And that's the whole point. When somebody says, "God only knows," you mean nobody knows, no human knows certain things. Okay, Son of Man, and even in Daniel 7, where there's this vision of the beasts rising from the depths of the ocean. It says, "After them appeared a figure like a son of man," and he represents the kingdom of the holy ones of the Most High, which seems to mean the people like the Essenes and the Hasidim, the pious Jews at the time this was written, persecuted by Antiochus Epiphanes. But it's just a metaphor, means a simile, one human in likeness, right? One like a son of man. Okay, by the time of the Gospels and the New Testament, more uses of that term, still meaning human being, have arrived on the scene. And I think four of them appear in the Gospels. One is this apocalyptic, eschatological meaning, where you're saying that the Son, one like a Son of Man, appears to redeem the world and defeat the demonic powers. Well, you probably would call him the Messiah, though Daniel doesn't. But that great figure will come. In 4th Ezra, he rises up out of the sea, and so on. So this one, that's a reference, kind of shorthand to the one like a son of man in Daniel chapter 7. It is really a title. It's kind of just an allusion. Then son of man usually means humanity or human being, just like in the Old Testament, But the twist here is that it is sometimes used as a circumlocution, that is, to talk around something. And it's just like you wouldn't say Yahweh or even God among some Jews in New Testament times, right? Rather, you would talk around it and use a kind of more general synonym. Are you the Christ, the Son of? Oh, good God! Of the blessed, and he says, "I am," or you say that I am. But from now on, you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Well, the blessed and power are kind of careful ways of referring to God, not throwing his name around when you don't have to. In the same way, Son of Man could refer to a human, particularly me, and this in a couple of settings. Suppose you've got a root canal coming up tomorrow and you're not looking forward to it. And somebody says, "Hey, Price, you going in for that root canal?" And I might say, well, the Son of Man is trying to get used to the idea. Who am I talking about? Well, obviously me, but it's sort of like speak of the devil and he'll appear. I want to speak as if it's somebody else because I wish it were. Another one would be, so something bad is going to happen and you, again, are like wishing it on somebody else. Another use would be when you're talking about yourself, but in terms of general humanity, so as to claim a common plight or privilege. Robert E. Howard once said to his girlfriend, "A man's got to have something to live for." Well, yeah, why are you saying it? Well, of course, he means himself. I have to have something to live for. I'm dissatisfied. So it's not outrageous that I should feel this way. I mean, everybody feels this way sooner or later. That's what you're saying. Then if you want, the privilege part. Jesus has this lame guy on his mat, and he figures, well, the poor guy must have done something wrong and sinful, for God will punish him with paralysis. And he says to the guy, "Your sins are forgiven you." And people in the crowd are saying, "What? Where do you get off saying that? Who can forgive sins but God?" And Jesus says, "Let me prove a point here. Is it easier, you think, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say to the guy, 'Get up, take up your stretcher and walk out of here'?" And then he does. He says to the guy, "Get up, take up your stretcher, stroll on out of here." And he does. And in Matthew, in Mark, he says, "This is so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." That is, as his Father does in heaven. Unless he means human beings in general do, as Matthew seems to think, because his conclusion is different. The people in the synagogue say, it says they marveled that God had given such authority to men. And so he understood Jesus to be just assuming a prerogative that any of them could have done. Or how about the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath? Is Jesus just insanely bragging that he invented the Sabbath and can call the shots on it? No, he wouldn't have been crucified. He'd have been put in a straitjacket. No, his point, he says, "Don't you remember in the Bible when David and his men were on the run from the authorities? They had nothing to eat. They were in danger of starving. They came up to the temple at Shiloh and asked the priest. They said, 'Look, we're starving here. Have you got any food?' 'Well, really only the reserved sacrament, the showbread, and only we priests are allowed to eat that.' But okay, go ahead. I know you're hungry. I don't want you fainting no dead away." And Jesus says, same thing. And here, human need outweighs it. He says, the Sabbath was delivered unto you. You weren't delivered unto it. Like God didn't create the Sabbath simply. This is great. It's like inventing the vacation. And he says, oh, I'm going to need some people to take vacation. So I guess I'll make the human race so they can go on vacation. No, he made the Sabbath for your easement, right? And so Jesus is saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's greater than the Sabbath. His need outweighs the Sabbath. He doesn't mean he himself. He means humans take precedence over it, and so on. So Son of Man often just means human beings in general. Does it ever mean anything particularly Christological? Gnostics did use the phrase Son of Man to mean Son of God, because some of them thought that Adam was God, and that a descendant of Adam, that Jesus, if he came directly from God, was the Son of God, or the son of Adam, the Son of Man. But I don't think you see anything like that in the Gospels. So there's an endless recital that may be more than you asked for.
Let's take a look at chapter 10, then we'll end the stream for today. Chapter 10, the finger paint evidence, a mess of messianic prophecy.
Oh boy. Yeah, I think he said the finger pointing, that all these prophecies refer to Jesus and they all came true. So you better believe he's the Messiah. That may be the most ridiculous of the bunch, especially since the case he gives of was a guy a rabbi or just Jewish? I forget. He goes out into the Western desert one day, and people have been telling him to look up these messianic prophecies, and he's like, gee, I don't know. Should I commit to this? And he prays to God, if Jesus is your son and he's the Messiah, convict me of it now. And bingo, he suddenly believed all those prophecies were of Jesus, and he converted. I got a bridge I'd like to sell you, pal. The problem is there are no messianic passages in the Old Testament. There are oracles for the enthronement of a new king, like Psalm 2. I will tell of the decree of Yahweh. He has said to me, today you are my son, today I have begotten you. Well, in context, it's about the king of Judah, whichever one is getting crowned that day. He says this, and part of the lyrics are said about him. Or there were similar things, perhaps like the unto us a son is given in Isaiah, that might have been birth oracles for the newborn prince. But that's what they seem to be, form critically. The so-called servant songs in Second Isaiah, which include Isaiah 53, we esteemed him stricken of God, but he was wounded for our transgressions, and so on. That also makes a lot of sense as part of the annual renewal of the mandate of heaven for the kings of Israel and Judah, that he was made the scapegoat for the sins of the nation. And he was ritually humiliated, slapped in the face by the high priest, etc., but then restored. And this was happening at the turn of the seasons. And so with his divine endorsement restored, now the world would become fruitful again. Kind of looks like that. It's not really a prophecy of anything if you look at the verb tenses. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? A prediction of Jesus? Come on. It's all the Psalms like that, and there are many of them, are what are called lament Psalms, where you're in deep trouble. Your creditors are after you, you're deathly ill. You go to the temple and you have somebody, one of the singers there, pick out one of the psalms that seems to fit you, and he sings it in your name. Oh, I'm a worm and no man, and so on and so on. And the idea is you swear to come back and offer a sacrifice when God restores your fortunes, and you're sure he will. Well, that's the point. In Mark, at the crucifixion, Jesus is at his last hour. And even at this late time of the day, he does not give up his faith in God. It has nothing to do with the Messiah, not originally or even in Mark. And they're all like that. They have to be ripped out of context and just read as if they were a fortune cookie by themselves. There aren't any. That's the idea of a Messiah. They had a sacred king idea, but the sacred king, he was the son of God. They, every time they inaugurated one, he was made the son of God. But that wasn't a future character, right? And eventually they came up with the idea that one day God would send a sacred king who was his son again to kick out the Romans and all of that. And that's why early Christology resembles the sacred king myth so much. No time to go into that at the moment. I've done it in several books and on several of these podcasts. But yeah, that's all just a gross instance of text twisting mania.
We have a super chat question from Paul Kickling. Thank you for your super chat. What the apostles brought to the public were hidden knowledge and initiatory mysteries from your and underground Christianity and spirit, spanning all religions. Christianity's essence is like pandeism.
I'm not sure what the evidence for that would be, because if it was secret and esoteric, you can't really point to what the records have them saying, because that would be the public exoteric stuff. Was there an inner truth? Yeah, I think there was. It's hard to know what it was, though, since they're not blabbing it in there. But I think in Mark, where it says to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, I think that's a reference to realized eschatology. Nobody expected that, but the early church came to believe it when the whole thing fell through. The paraclete who was to come to teach the disciples those deep things that they weren't ready for yet. I think that also was realized eschatology, and for the same reason. Clement of Alexandria says that there was apparently a bunch of stuff the disciples taught in secret. And he says that's why you need to have not just faith, but knowledge. And he even called himself a Gnostic, though he somehow wasn't as radical as the ones he knew of, like the Carpocratians and the Valentinians. So I don't think we know what he thought it was, but boy, would I love to, because it must have been some kind of thing they wouldn't trust to the common everyday Christian. And so who knows what it was? Maybe it was what the Gnostics said, or some philosophia perennis like you're suggesting. But I don't know that there's any real reliable record of that.
Let's take a look at the next super chat. Paul Kickling again. Thanks again for another super chat. Initiates were made to realize how much power and effect any human has in the divine order. Because Christianity disseminated this, it subliminally made people become better morally when wielding godly power.
Well, how do you know, if I may ask, that they taught precisely this sort of thing, an innate deity in the human being and so forth? You seem to have it worked out in some detail that I have to confess I don't see in the New Testament, but I realize that the New Testament as we have it is certainly not necessarily all these guys originally taught. I just wonder if it can be recovered.
Well, thanks for joining me again, Dr. Price. I really enjoyed this stream.
Oh, me too.
Next time we talk, we're going to go over the remaining chapters of the book, the case for Christ.
Sounds like fun.
Yep. Thanks again, Dr. Price.
You bet.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.